Okay, I'm here with Kristen Hare from the Poynter Institute for our second guest speaker of the spring 2018 semester in our Business of Journalism class. And all of the students have been invited to join us in the room here with us, and hopefully some will join or they will watch the video later when it's embedded in the classroom. But let me go ahead and get started. Kristen, I thought the first thing we could talk about maybe was a little bit about your career path and how you ended up with the beat you have right now. And maybe you can tell us about the beat also.
Sure. So I feel like I've had a little bit of an unconventional path to journalism. I was a high school journalist in Springfield, Missouri at Glendale High School. I started my sophomore year. I was the editor of the paper by my senior year. I went to the University of Missouri at Columbia and studied journalism and kind of fell in love with daily journalism at the semester that you have to do there at the Missourian, which is the daily newspaper. Wanted to be a capital W writer. That was the thing that was the most interesting to me. And then the unconventional part comes in because after I graduated, I joined the Peace Corps. And so I took a 2-year break from journalism. But I never really took a break from journalism. And I ended up teaching what was basically sex ed in Guyana and South America. I did a newsletter there for the Peace Corps, and I continued writing and taking photos. And I remember at the time, right as I was getting ready to graduate and join the Peace Corps, a friend of mine who was a reporter said, you're kind of going to hurt yourself in the long run because you'll miss this critical period of being a reporter because you're doing something else. And I felt like then that and my answer was, if I'm going to spend the rest of my life telling other people's stories, I want to have some of my own. And that helped me hugely in the first job that I got, which was at the St. Joseph, Missouri News Press. I got the dream job for most writers of being their Sunday features reporter. And they told me at the time that I stood out amongst other candidates because I had life experience. And so that was a huge help for me. I spent 5 years there. I spent 5 years in St. Louis at the St. Louis Beacon, which is now part of St. Louis Public Radio. And I like to joke that my first job taught me to write and my second job taught me to report. So I kind of did it backwards. But I worked with some fantastic editors in St. Louis, former Post-Dispatch people. And then right as the Beacon was merging with St. Louis Public Radio, my husband had the opportunity to take a year position in Tampa, Florida. And so my kids were little at the time, and we said, what the heck? The Beacon was going to let me work remotely. We got down here and looked at each other after about a week and said, we're never going back to winter or our family or anything else. We love it here. I miss the Cardinals, but I do not miss Missouri winters. And I've been here for 4.5 years. And I started here as a media reporter, which was daunting to me at the time, but it's a beat just like any other. And because I'm come from local journalism, that is the thing that I have always pursued. So in 2014, I was paying close attention to what was happening in St. Louis and Ferguson, and specifically how local news organizations were covering it. Once police started arresting local journalists, Poynter decided to send me down there. I spent the day of the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando at the Orlando Sentinel, watching how that newsroom was reporting that story, and just kept kind of finding local stories until my editor pitched it as a beat and a grant-funded job. And now I travel to newsrooms around the U.S., specifically legacy newsrooms, newspapers, to see how they're transforming to become digital.
Why? Why are you focused specifically on legacy news organizations and not looking at how sort of new news organizations are disrupting the legacy organizations?
So that's a huge part of my beat. But the places that I'm traveling to are places that have the muscle memory of, a fantastic institutional knowledge, traditions of investigative reporting and watchdog reporting, and are fumbling in every other way that they could in trying to transform. So I think that for me as a storyteller, it's that tension is interesting between old and new, and the ways that news organizations kind of hold themselves back because this is how they've always done it and they cling to that. But I've seen some really fascinating examples of newsrooms who have both kind of changed through revolution and those who've changed through evolution. And so I think it's a compelling story. It's a place where our audience is really interested in, but I definitely spend a lot of time with local independent online publications because they have none of the baggage that the legacy pubs do.
Right, right. I'm going to come back to what you said a minute ago about evolution versus revolution, because that's interesting and I want to hear more about that. But I guess I want to also hear about, I was reading one of your stories from a couple of months ago about small Missouri newsrooms trying to learn from students about how to use social media, for example. And one of the commenters on one of those articles talked about, yeah, great. How is this going to help me sell more newspapers? And my reaction to that right away is, you're missing the point.
Asking the wrong question. Yeah.
So, and I'm wondering what your reaction to that was.
Yeah, it's not about selling more newspapers. It's about showing, I think, first of all, you have to have what I love the tech world term of a minimum viable product. Like, how can you show people that you're essential to them if you're not essential to them, if they don't know that you're updating the news online? If you're, in the case of these weeklies across the state, they weren't updating their news online. They were dumping everything once a week. And we know that digital habits are habits. People are trained to go check things because they're going to, will be updated. So if you're not thinking digitally, your audience isn't going to go where you are. And I think that I feel like it's accepted that no one's going to be saved by print. That isn't the future. It may be the past, and it certainly is for a lot of people the present, but it's not the only thing that's going to keep newsrooms sustainable. I will say that there are newsrooms that are doing really interesting things with print. Mario Garcia, who is a designer and has done a lot of consulting for Poynter, he talks about sort of the lean back experience that you have with a magazine, that you have with a book, and that to me is the kind of something that's going to last longer, that people want to put in your hands. So the Philadelphia Media Network, which runs the Inquirer and the Daily News, they've made a lot of money from doing products like a dining guide, a restaurant guide, travel guides. So taking the best work of their newsroom that has the longest tail and putting it into a premium print product that people will want to pay for. So it's not that print isn't valuable. I think it is. But yeah, I think that was probably the wrong thing to take away from that story, but it's also pretty common.
And how much do you encounter that kind of attitude from sort of legacy journalists, as we've been talking about?
Anymore in the newsrooms that I go to, so here's the best way. I'm going to answer this with a quote that somebody gave me. So Suki Dardarian is the managing editor of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. And Minneapolis is an example of evolution. They have gone through and worked really hard to train their journalists that have been there, in some cases, for their entire careers, with a new set of skills, without losing the journalism chops that they have. And there's always this tension in newsrooms, and there always has been this tension in newsrooms between young people, kind of middle career people, and veterans. And there's always been a tension between old and new in the way that we're having it. We're seeing it now faster and harder than ever before. But Suki said, there used to be a sense that either you got it or you didn't. And I think that you probably experienced that. I've been in newsrooms where there were clearly two camps. And what she told me when I visited 2 years ago was, it's no longer do you get it or do you not? Everyone wants to get it. The question is now, how do we help them? So my sense from the places that I've visited is, if you're still in a newsroom, if you have managed to survive all of the disruption that has happened so far, you want to get it. And what you want is just for people to help you figure it out. You also want to keep your job. You want to do the work that you're supposed to be doing, and probably the work of 5 other people who are no longer there. And so I think what was interesting about that series of stories was, those were newsrooms that did not have the resources, the people, or the time to stop and to develop some new habits. But having somebody come in and gently make some suggestions was hugely impactful for them. The biggest thing I think for a lot of journalists in changing what they're doing is to show that it will help them do their job better. I like to say that we're an evidence-based people. We just have to see the evidence. And so that was an example of seeing it sort of directly in those newsrooms.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned evolution. Do you see examples of revolution?
So the best example of revolution that I've seen is the Dallas Morning News. And they were actually the first story, the first newsroom that I visited, and the first story that led me onto this, into the beat that I have now. So they were in the first table stakes group. That's a Knight-funded group that is now in its third iteration of working with legacy newsrooms to help them transform. And my job is funded by the Knight Foundation now. And table stakes basically is like the minimum that you have to stay at the table when you're gambling. I'm not a gambler, so I had to figure that out. But so what I saw in Dallas, and they had started this process before they got involved with table stakes, but what I saw in Dallas was there was both a top-down and a bottom-up effort to change what was happening. So they hired Mike Wilson, who was previously at the St. Petersburg Times and was the editor who helped start 538. And then they hired Robin Tomlin, who came from a number of digital organizations and was at Pew for a while. And so they had support from the publisher, support from their leaders, and then they tasked the newsroom with creating spending months on a report, a call to arms report, basically outline what needed to change and how. And then they did it. They broke down their structures. They totally changed their beats. Everyone had to reapply for their jobs, which we've seen in a lot of places. But in this case, it was an opportunity, I think. I'm sure there were people who will disagree with that, but it was an opportunity to realign. And I think a lot of times what I've noticed is newsrooms will kind of scaffold the changes that they're able to do. At Dallas, it looked like they just did it all at once. And one of the revolutionary things that they did that I have not seen very many other places do is they literally put print in a corner. They took all of the thinking that goes into the print product, which, you know, if you're in an American newspaper newsroom, you're probably talking about your story in terms of inches instead of words. Words are digital, inches are print. You're talking about placement. Is that an A1? Well, there's no A1 on the internet, right? And it's not even really the homepage. It's how is it doing on social is your A1. And changing the way you think about this language and the way we think about things. So they divorced that thinking for newsrooms and put a specific team in charge of curating what was on the web all day for print. And so there are other newsrooms that are doing this. I understand. I think that Milwaukee, where I was just last week, I think that's what they're working on. So there are some other newsrooms that have done this successfully. But you know, if you're saying you're not going to be about print or you want to be digital first, then you have to remove, I think, or start to remove the assembly line process that a lot of American newspapers have in place. And so Dallas did that.
That's very interesting. I mean, it sounds like stuff that we talked about doing decades ago.
I think it is.
Nobody was ready for it, and here we are.
There was no business imperative to do it at the time. You know, even if it was smart. One of the things that I sort of scratch my head at now is the things that we did at the Beacon. You know, now 10 years ago that I'm just now reporting on people doing events, you know, membership, community engagement. You know, we had a social media person when I didn't even know what that person's job was. I was like, does she just get to play on Facebook all day? So there are a lot of things that I think didn't matter to people until there was a business.
Well, and I might argue that maybe your phrasing is right. Maybe there wasn't a digital imperative, but what I would argue perhaps is that the people who are running news organizations were not being visionary.
No,
they weren't. They were waiting for an imperative that was around the corner that they couldn't see. So
well, and I think the thing this is what's interesting to me right now, and what I'm starting to see in my reporting and in my travels is there there has been a sense, when I first started working at Poynter, and I think even before then when I was in digital from print, there was this kind of recurring question of, well, what's going to replace the ad dollars? What is the thing? You know, we have this and we need to replace it with this. What's that going to be? And I think there is now more than I've ever seen before an understanding that this is going to be replaced by this, and this, and we're still not sure if that's going to work, so we're going to keep trying. Mm-hmm. And this sense that newsrooms have that it will never be the way that it was. It is the way that it is now. We have to be comfortable with constant change. And, you know, we worked in an industry that had generations of not having to think that way. So this has been a big adjustment.
Right. And I will say, I mean, saying lack of vision is only part of the issue. Right. I mean, so in fairness, I do believe there was a lack of vision, but I also believe there were circumstances that were out of the control of legacy news organizations. I think there was also a lot of, we have profit margins that we have to hit because we're now public companies.
Right.
And if we're not hitting those profit margins, then we're not serving shareholders. And as a result, they didn't place the resources necessary to invest in the future. Right. But anyway, that's where we are. So who is doing it really well? Who have you encountered while you've been covering this beat? When you talk about replacing this with this, and this, what are these things that you're finding?
So there's a number. So I think the first is, and the most obvious is digital subscriptions. And, you know, the New York Times and the Washington Post are doing it better than anyone else. I mean, it's almost not even fair to talk about them. They have huge runways, you know, a ton of talent, and they started asking these questions a lot sooner than other people did, and have, I think you can fairly say, have put the resources toward figuring them out. But I just was in Seattle last month, and this is a story that I'm writing right now at the Seattle Times, a newsroom like other newsrooms that I visited that is, you know, half to a third of the size that it once was. I mean, just significantly smaller. One of the things that we've seen, and I think this is the thing that gives more veteran journalists a little bit of heartache when we talk about digital, is, you know, if we're paying attention to analytics, how are we not becoming clickbait factories? How are we not just, well, the audience wants us to write about, you know, the guy who was drunk at the Blues game and threw up all over the ice, and I don't know that really happened, but you know, how do we not just become sort of garbage fires all the time? And what we've seen, and the American Press Institute has a great study about this, what we've seen is that what readers want from us online is they want local crime, they want, you know, investigative reporting, they want in-depth work that they can't get anywhere else. I mean, those are sort of the pillars that journalists want to do, right? Is to hold their communities accountable, watch them, and tell their stories. And so Seattle, I think, has come up with a really great way of walking their talk. And they have built an in-house analytics tool that every reporter will have access to. And a lot of newsrooms are judged by, in the newsroom, you're judged by clicks, right? And if you're lucky, you're judged by how long people actually spend on your story, which is, I think, a much more important thing to measure than just how far did you go. So the Times is no longer just going to measure scale, but they're going to measure conversions. And so they've come up with a tool that will tell reporters, and goals based around those, your work helped convert 5 people last month into becoming subscribers. The work that we do when we're doing subscription-based work, you would hope is not about clickbait. It's not about scale, because that's stuff that anyone can get anywhere on the internet, but it's about good, solid reporting that hopefully causes an impact in your community. So that, I think, is really exciting. Dallas has started hitting their digital subscription goals. They have a paywall. They had a cake last month. Newsroom cakes are a fun thing. That was, you couldn't, the picture on the cake was you couldn't click on it because it was behind the paywall on the icing. That was really fun. And a lot of newsrooms are tightening up their paywalls. They used to be 10, now they're 5. They're making it harder to kind of browse or shop and keep reading. And they're doing a much better job Seattle's a good example of this, of using things like newsletters as a way to get people in the habit of reading them, to send them to their work, and to convince them. We talk about the funnel, and the newsletters are up at the top of the funnel, and we're going to get you interested. You're going to realize we're a source. You're going to read our newsletters. You're going to click more. You're going to realize you can't get past the paywall. You're going to subscribe. We're going to become a part of your daily life. And so I think there are some newsrooms that are doing a good job. So that's one, is digital subscriptions. Another is membership. And this is sort of maybe the yin to the yang of subscriptions. And so with memberships, the Membership Puzzle Project at NYU is doing fascinating work about this. They're following the correspondent out of the Netherlands and working to bring them to America. What they've found is that there is a difference between being a member and a donor. And so, we think about public radio. You're a donor. You're going to pay because you listen, because you value their work. You're going to get a tote bag or a mug. You're going to put a bumper sticker in your car. You're going to drive away. Membership is you're going to join the cause because it's something you believe in, and you want to pay for it so that other people can have access to it. So it's sort of the opposite of the walled garden. It is sort of the public garden that anybody can come and use, and we're going to help make this possible. And the way that newsrooms are doing that is they're staying really engaged with their audience, and they're finding ways to use their members that aren't just financial. So maybe one of them has a podcast skill and they can help you do that. Maybe one of the things that they're working on at the Membership Puzzle Project is creating a way to support beats directly. So not just a publication, but I like how this reporter covers food in my community. I want to support this beat. Not only will I financially be supporting them, but maybe I'll get to see early drafts. Maybe I will get to contribute to conversations about where they should be looking. That person will be in regular contact with me. So that, I think, that membership model is really interesting. And I did a piece the very beginning of the year about an online site called Brookliner, which has been around for a decade. And they were ad-based. They still are supported by ads, but toward the end of the year, Liana Zagare, who runs it, just felt like we can't do this anymore the way that we are. And she was pretty much ready to just close up. And she spoke with Mary Walter Brown at the News Revenue Hub. And her recommendation was, ask your community. Most of the places that just close, what they hear afterward from the community is, we didn't know this was a problem. We didn't know you needed us. And so she did, and was able to stay open and is continuing to raise money. So that's more of a donor base than a membership base, but there are opportunities to get people involved. Events are something that we're talking about right now in my newsletter, Local Edition. And it's something that I'm really interested in understanding more about. These are ways that newsrooms, I think public radio is good at this. Newspapers haven't been as good. It's not like, hey, eat some pizza and tell us what you think about us. But we have access to great events and smart people, and can bring you in if you want to buy a ticket. So the Minneapolis Star-Tribune did one a couple years ago, and they had their photographers. It was when there was a big ice skating championship in town, and people could sign up and pay a little bit of money and get basically a photo workshop with the Star-Tribune's photographers, and then be entered in a contest around this championship, and the winner got to go and help take pictures and be there, which is really neat. And so there are things like that. Gannett has its Storytellers project, which is, I think, in like 21 cities, where they're combining live storytelling with journalistic practices of true storytelling and putting it on stage. And those, in most of the cities, I think by year 2, they're profitable. They're able to cover their ticket charges, and they've spun that off into a whole storytelling event services that they have. Grant funding is another way that newsrooms are making money. They are finding places that want to support work and work that they want to do. So the Times-Picayune in New Orleans has funded their environmental team this way. This is one of those things that, again, I think gives some journalists a little bit of discomfort because, you know, where's the firewall? And so newsrooms have to be really smart about, we're going to get this through this network. And, you know, environmental reporters, they're going to be the ones who have to deal with the agreements of this. We're going to do the work. Don't answer to anyone. But that's another way that newsrooms are able to do both to fund beats and projects. And then the last one is just kind of fun, and that's you know, products, things that you wouldn't think of, merchandise. Richland Source in Ohio, which is an online publication, did something where they sponsored popcorn bags, and then they have a T-shirt shop. They have CDs. There aren't things though about the newsroom. There are things about the zip code and the place where they live. And so they've taken that sense of place and helped create merchandise out of it. That is, I think, another revenue stream that they can have.
Mm-hmm. Those are all really interesting, and my sense is that what we're probably finding is that yes, we're supporting this with this, and this, as you said before, but once upon a time, this was here, and it's not going to be here anymore. It's going to be here, and we're going to have to get used to reconfiguring our expectations about that. Let me ask you, one of the things that our students will read, and they've already started reading actually, is the digital riptide report that was done by the Shorenstein Center a few years ago, the oral history. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not. It's, I can send you a link to it, but it's sort of this interview with 60 individuals from, you know, all walks of the digital world, you know, from classifieds, from AOL. Steve Case is one of the people who was interviewed, newspaper publishers, editors, and it's basically an oral history of how the bottom fell out and what ended up happening. And one of the key conversations in this is about the idea of, well, why didn't newspapers charge for what they were doing? And the conclusion was that the sort of, you know, when Yahoo started licensing Reuters content and giving it away for free, the horse kind of left the barn, and newspapers were left trying to figure out how to hang on to their market share and keep people coming in. I'm wondering if you've thought about why we are just now getting around to having customers readers pay for the content.
Yeah, it's such a good question, and actually mirrors something I was just talking about with somebody this morning. You know, we've trained our audience not to pay for us. We've trained them that we should be available for free. And now we have to change that and show that this is work that's worth paying for. And so I remember.
And if I can interject here, I mean, we started training them a long time ago because subscription revenue never supported journalism.
Yeah.
So.
Right. Right. And so I think that this is supported by other things. Okay. Well, I have a sense. I think I'm probably too young to know this. I started my first reporting job in 2003. You know, we were online, but it was very much an afterthought, and that wasn't really how people were getting information. But I think that my sense now is that there was a feeling that, this will change, or this will go away. This won't be as disruptive as it was. I think when you add in Google and Facebook, and this way that people share information and are in sort of community with each other, I think what you get is kind of several punches at once happening online that no one predicted. I think also, so we haven't had a tradition of asking people to pay for things. Places that do, like the Wall Street Journal, which has had a hard paywall, you can't get around it. If you want to read it, you're going to pay for it, has not had a hard time getting more digital subscribers. And they do not take down their paywall, by the way. for elections, for big events. They keep them up. What they found, one of my coworkers did a story about it, is that that people, they had higher subscription rates because people wanted to pay for it. So I think that my sense is that maybe there was an idea that people weren't taking this as seriously as they should. And that I think the other problem is that technology is so rapidly changing now that if you're not adapting, if you're not changing how you deal, how you read, how you listen, how you watch, then it can seem like it's not happening. It can seem like it's not real. Well, if you still read the newspaper every day in print and you wait for it, you may not be aware of what a different experience it is to read the news on your phone or to get a push alert, or how to deal with social and understand how quickly misinformation gets out there. So I think the other side of that is people didn't change habits because they didn't think they had to. And so they did not see the train that was barreling toward them very quickly in the tunnel.
Sure. The unit that we're working on right now really focuses heavily on the idea of disruption and how industries get disrupted, and how, in particular, journalism, the newspaper industry specifically, and news in general, has been disrupted by the internet. One of our students, Juwan, wants to know, and since you mentioned you started in 2003, you were sort of already, the process had already kind of started when you began your journalism career. Have you personally experienced the effects of disruption of the industry?
Definitely. Although it took a while because I like to think that I had the first 5 years of my career in a healthy traditional newsroom there was one guy who thought about online. It was very slow changing. I switched very quickly over to digital only at the Beacon, but I didn't change anything about the way that I work. And so I changed my platform without changing my behavior. And I remember at the time someone saying, well, are you going to miss working for newspapers? And I said, well, as long as people read it, I'm happy. But my thought was just, I'm going to put this here instead of here. And it really wasn't until I started working for Poynter that I realized that my behavior as a user, as a reader, as a listener, and as a watcher was different online than it was in more traditional mediums. And that if I wanted to get an audience in the space where I work, which is only digital now, I had to do the things that were making me read. I had to write better headlines. I had to be active on social media. I had to pay attention to where people were stopping reading my story because I was going off on a soliloquy, and people have a million other options. I had to be much smarter.
Wait a minute. Yeah. Talk about that a little bit more. What do you mean? Where people were stopping to read your story?
So we use Chartbeat at Poynter. And we have a function on it where you can turn it on. When I publish a story, I go and there's a little toolbar up in the right-hand corner. I can turn it on, and I can see how far people, it'll tell me 80% of people have made it this far, 75, 73. I can watch people leave, which is heartbreaking, but it's also really helpful. So I'm not going to worry if people are leaving 1, 2, 3% as they go down. I understand. But especially in my longer stories, if I'm losing a 5 to 10% chunk of people, that's me. That's not them. If that many people are like, then I'm going to go in there. And usually what it is it's a section where I've just been too wordy, or I have not explained clearly something. I'm spending too much time. It's always those little sections. So I've used those kind of digital tools to help my writing hopefully become more compelling and want to get you to the end. I'm someone who writes my endings first. So my entire goal is to get you all the way to the end, because that's the thing that I'm the most excited about.
So you're using the tools to change the way you do journalism.
Absolutely have.
Which is what you were talking about before. Instead of just taking journalism up from here and plopping it down over here,
And let me give you my St. Louis example for this. So when I first started at Poynter, I hated Twitter. I thought it was vapid and self-serving and noisy and, you know, annoying. I still think it is those things in certain measures. But I'd been working for Poynter for about 3 months, and I write about journalists. And guess who lives on Twitter? Journalists. That's where my audience is. So I mentioned to my editor at the time, and he kind of looked at me and said, well, why don't you just try it a little bit longer? And I agreed to do that. And on the night that Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, I was at my mom's in Lake St. Louis picking up my kids who had spent a couple weeks with her that summer. And we put them to bed, you know, TV's off, there's no news on, there's no, you know, I at this point don't have any push alerts. And I got a glass of wine, sat down on her couch and opened up my phone and just started scrolling Twitter. I was trying to build that into my habits. And I started my Twitter account when I lived in St. Louis and have still a lot of journalists in St. Louis that I follow. At the time, that was the majority of people that I followed. So I had a little bit of a amplification of that group. And I started watching people who are on the ground on West Florissant reporting what was happening. And I compared the volume that I was hearing and seeing on what was happening with Ferguson with what I was seeing on the rest of the internet. And there was, you know, it was very different. So I got home the next day to Florida and I created a Twitter list of journalists who were actively in St. Louis covering what was happening. And it's a list I still maintain. I have a friend that works at Twitter that contacted me later and said it had incredible engagement because what I was doing was I was creating a tool. I was using this tool that I sort of poo-pooed, and it was showing me a story that I needed to tell and that I needed to help amplify that journalists on the ground were telling. And so it immediately became useful for me. And so again, we're evidence-based people. It helped me find stories that I would not have found for my beat in any other way, faster than in any other way that I would have found them. And so it became a way for me to report, and it is now part of what I do. I also used to write my leads first, and I started thinking when I pick up my phone, when I open up my computer and I read a story, what's the thing that gets me? It's not the lead, it's the headline. Actually, it's the image. The photography, the photojournalism is the thing that's probably going to catch me. And then it's going to be the headline. And if the headline is not great, if it's one of these word, colon, sentence like newspapers like to do, I'm probably not going to read it. It's not going to be compelling. If it's, on the other hand, trashy and feels like, you know, something that I would hear, you know, at the mall, I'm probably not going to click on that either. So learning to work the way that I read has been one of the ways that I've done that. The other has just been, I think, maintaining the good things that I learned from 5 years in newspapers and my 5 years at the Beacon, which is that in-depth reporting, you know, vivid storytelling. There's no headline, you know, photo tweet combination that can replace that. If you don't have those building blocks in your work, all the digital skills in the world won't help you.
Mm-hmm. So that's great, and that kind of can dovetail with another question from a student. Jessica, I'm going to paraphrase her question a little bit. You know, if you could wave your magic wand or bonk somebody over the head or shake them by the collar or just have coffee with them and persuade them, what are some of the journalism practices that you would want to change right now?
The biggest one is the righteous way that a lot of journalists cling to ignorance about the business side of what we do. I spent a month talking about this in my newsletter and was just stunned at the silence and the unwillingness to think about what we do. And so for a lot of us, and I don't know if journalism schools are still like this, but based on what I see, I think they are, there's a wall that is held sacred. And I understand why. I think that it's really important that journalism stays independent. But I also think that we're reporters, we're journalists, we make a business of finding things out. If we're not curious about how the work that we're doing is being paid for, about how it's sustainable, I think that, you're in for a surprise and you're kidding yourself. I don't think that means that you need to be sitting at the table when ads are being sold or when people are talking about, how do we convert subscribers? But I do think you need to be at least moderately literate in how those things work. And convincing journalists that that's important is really hard. The way that I've heard it described best, and I repeat it again, is by the editor of the Richland Source in Ohio. And that's an online publication founded by a businessman doing really great local work. They're a for-profit site. And he talks about that in his newsroom, at least, there's no more wall. There is a fence. It's about waist high, and they will meet and talk over the fence, and they can see each other. And I think that's a useful way to start to evolve the way that we think about the business of what we do. I don't blame anyone for not wanting to think about that. It's way more fun to exist in a world of ideas and concepts and these sort of higher order thinking of protecting democracy. But we can't do those things if the places that we work for are closing, because the way that they're trying to support the business are ways that aren't working anymore. So that's the sort of the biggest thing that is there for me. I think the other thing is being open to learning from different generations. And I would say to the oldest people in the room, the youngest people in the room have some fantastic things that you can learn, habits to change, ways to tell stories. I would say to the youngest people in the room, the oldest people in the room know this place better than anybody else. And if you can sit with them for a little while, they will teach you things that will take you a career to build. They could teach you them pretty quickly. So I think that generational, we've sort of been divided generationally by digital disruption, and the smartest people are going to hop over those divides and still keep learning from each other.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. What comes to mind as you're talking about this is going back to the Dallas Morning News and the idea that, actually people can be held accountable for what they're producing now.
Yes.
And, in my younger days as a newspaper reporter, I would write these incremental stories about things that were happening on my beat, thinking that I was serving the public and doing the right thing, but really had no idea how much of what I was producing was actually getting read. Yeah. And now I do. Now I can. And even further, you're saying they can know not only did they read it, but it created a conversion. It added to our subscriber base, because we can track how the reader came through your story to the subscription page. Yeah. So, for a certain generation of people, I'm sure that's very scary. On the other hand, television journalists are kind of used to this. They've been measured all their lives. They know that if the ratings on the evening newscast go down, they're out. So,
yep. Analytics are tough, and I continually have to make choices about what I'm doing, and I have to continually check myself and ask. I think that one of the things that analytics, if you're paying attention to them, force you to do is ask, am I writing this for my sources, or am I writing this for my audience? And those kind of incremental stories that you mentioned, for a lot of beat reporters, that's for their sources. It's to show that I know everything. I know what's going on. Does your audience care? Do they need it? Is there a better way you can do it? Can you bullet it out really quickly in a list instead of writing that 3,000 word story? How do you get people the information that they need without wasting their time?
Right.
And that is,
Well, it's funny too, as I think back on this, one of the things I'm thinking of is the time I spent at the Sun Sentinel in Fort Lauderdale. And at the time, the Sun Sentinel was happy to advertise itself as the fastest growing newspaper in Florida. And the news hole was gargantuan. Right. So, you had to produce a crap ton of stuff to make sure that the paper got out every day. Otherwise, you'd have this. You can't run white space. Right. So it's really funny how, we're not serving the public, and yet here we are with these massive newspapers full of news hole that we can barely fill. Anyway.
one of the things that I'm hearing in more of the newsrooms that I'm visiting is a recognition that they're no longer the newspaper of record. And the other thing that I hear then after they say that is, actually, maybe we were really never the newspaper of record. We never got everything. There have always been communities and populations that we didn't cover because we didn't think they were important. So I think changing the lens of we have everything to we have the things that will help you understand life here is a pretty big one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm looking at some of the questions here from students, and Kathleen asked a couple of them that I think we already addressed, like how have you had to adapt to the shift in journalism? What piece of advice is important for an aspiring journalist in the—
Oh, I have an answer for that one.
Oh, go for it.
I'd love to talk about this. Start local, work local, stay local. You will never, I think it's really easy for young journalists to get brand blind and to think, oh, I want to go work at the Times, or I want to work at Politico, or I want to, I want to go to BuzzFeed. I want to work at the biggest place. But for me, the best thing that I did was starting my career at a local newsroom. And it was probably, honestly, the best job that I'll ever have. I hate to say that. I hope I didn't peak at the very beginning of my career. But, I got to write Sunday features. I wrote like 3 stories a week. It was incredibly amazing. And I was able to work with people who had the time to work with me and teach me things that I would not have learned anyplace else. And so, it's not about the place, it's about the work that you get to do. And so that is a lens that if you're looking for a job in journalism, go where the great storytelling is. Don't go where the big masthead is that's going to impress, somebody that you run into at a bar. Go to the place where you can do the best work. And that's probably going to be in the beginning of your career, and hopefully for the rest of your career, a local newsroom.
Okay, good. So this question is from Christina, and I'm going to just read this question, and maybe you can take it where you want to take it. With the decline in newspapers, do you think more citizens will start grassroots efforts to maintain local government accountability by writing their own articles or to cover topics that traditional journalism can no longer cover?
Yes, and they have. So one of my freelance coworkers, David Beard, has done a really interesting job of tracking how librarians are starting to take up the mantle of protecting democracy by doing versions of reporting, citizen reporting, which I think is very interesting. There are also publications like East Lansing Info, which is another online-only publication that is really mostly run by volunteers. They have a part-time editor. The publisher isn't paid. She's running this almost as a charity. They have people who go to, city council meetings and report back to them about what happened. I think that there are pockets of that happening, but I think it's not enough. It does not replace traditional watchdog journalism, and places that no longer have that won't make the news until something really bad happens. I think that's happening. The other thing that I think is happening that I think is scary is, you guys are probably all familiar with the term news deserts. I think we tend to think of news deserts the same way we think of food deserts, which is they're going to be in maybe urban places. They're going to be in places, that are maybe specifically rural. And I'm concerned that we're starting to see news deserts in the suburbs. So I think the Post-Dispatch is an interesting example. When I lived in St. Louis in the very beginning, I did some work for the suburban journals for a while. And I believe the Post-Dispatch bought those. I think they have contracted and contracted and contracted.
They don't really exist anymore.
Yeah. Right. And so the newsrooms are significantly smaller than they used to, and they no longer have these satellite newsrooms covering those communities. So if something is afoot in St. Charles or Creve Coeur or Kirkwood, who's going to that? How do we know that that's happening? So that's an area that I'm really concerned about. I do think that there are efforts by citizens to watch those things, but it's not uniform or universal.
Sure. the students have already heard me share this story on a previous talk, but the idea that when we started patch.com, which was a great idea, but not well executed, one of the first things we did was start going to the police departments in Chesterfield and Kirkwood and Webster and Florissant and ask to see the police blotter. And it had really been so long since anybody had asked them that they forgot that they were supposed to let us see them. We, in some cases, had to go and fight them to let us see public records that we knew good and well they had to let us see, because nobody had asked. So,
and that's the thing about Sunshine is, like, if you can keep it coming in, it's easy. But once people start building roofs, it's real hard to break through them.
Yeah, yeah. So we can shift a little bit to social media here, and Liz was noticing the dust up you had with Mark Johnson a couple of weeks ago, and she was interested in how that got handled, how social media may have had an effect on the way that played out, and how you feel like it got handled in the end.
It's a great question, and Mark is actually really probably not the instigator for that. It was, a community of photojournalists who I think rightly felt really pissed at us for kind of missing a whole part of a conversation in trying to solve one problem. We I think both pointed out and brought up another one, although I don't think that we created it. I mean, we couldn't. We're just two reporters, so we didn't certainly create job cuts and all of the things that are hurting newsrooms. But I am victim, like a lot of people are, I think, to sort of thinking of photography as a commodity instead of, an equal, if not better, to the work that I do. And the thing that helped me through this process actually wasn't social media. Social media was the thing. I play this game with my kids sometimes. I'll throw a penny in the pool and they'll have to go look for it, and they'll come up and I'll say, "You're getting colder." Social media for me was that you're getting hotter. So the wave, this was the first that I've experienced a Twitter storm, and the wave of anger that we saw there was, alarming, and certainly got our attention right away. But the thing that helped me understand where we went wrong was actually from the people like Mark, who took the time to write us emails and take that conversation into more of a one-on-one space and take the time to really talk. There were people who did that with me on Twitter and direct messages. Anybody who took the time to have a personal conversation, I think that we were able to help us understand something that we just missed and took me probably, close to 24 hours to really process. But the other thing is, and I have had people reach out to me to say, like, "How are you? You went through a Twitter storm. Are you okay?" This was an audience of journalists that at the end of the day were being professionals and they were passionate about something. We weren't doxxed. We weren't attacked. We never felt safe offline. And so as not fun as that was to go through, I also have this perspective of covering the media and knowing what it's like for journalists covering other beats to get attacked and how vicious that can be. Alex Harris at the Miami Herald was reporting last week about the shooting, the high school shooting, and got attacked really fast. Her tweets were doctored to make it look like she was asking things she wasn't, and that was a very scary thing. So it was not fun. Tried to be a professional about it, and luckily had an audience of people who were also professionals about it. And so we're still going to cover that story and try to do the best that we can. But the best thing that I learned early in my career at Poynter was that I do not fight with people on social media. If they would like to fight with me, I would love to talk to them on the phone. I'm happy to email with them, but I can't in 280 characters. I can't have a fight with someone. I wouldn't yell at you in the parking lot at the grocery store, Schnucks. I would stand aside with you and talk to you. And so I think the whole experience just reinforced to me that social is important. It's a signal, but that the space that real change happens is still more of a personal space.
Sure. I'm going to take a question here from Brooke, who noted your experience where we started, your Sunday job for the newspaper in Missouri. And we know that the Sunday paper at one time was sort of the cash cow for the newspapers. What kind of pressure was it to be working for that at the time? And do you have sort of, I'm adding to her question and to say, do you miss that? Is there something new that's taken its place, do you think?
That's a great question. I didn't know when I started my job how lucky I was, and I didn't realize the pressure until like my first week. And then I was like, oh my God, this is a really amazing job. I worked for a great editor who I'm still good friends with, who really her job was helping me find great stories and then getting out of the way and giving me the space to tell them. So I don't feel like I ever felt pressure other than to do great storytelling. I miss that a lot. But I think, 39-year-old me would go back and tell 25-year-old me, 26-year-old me, it needs to be tougher. It needs to be harder. You need to have more bite. These stories need to be about social issues. Don't take me to the fair, or if you're going to take me to the fair and show me the people who have to travel with us. This is their way of surviving. Tell me stories that have more impact and are less pretty. I think that we see that kind of work, that sort of style and substance now. And, I can't keep up with all of it on the internet. There are places that have traditions of doing amazing work in print that have moved that work online and are finding that people will stay with it. I'm just reading a piece about the Black Panther on the New Yorker, and I've paused it. Will continue because it's so good. I think great storytelling is great storytelling. I now, at this point in my career, I want it to have more impact than I did when I first started, which is probably a pretty natural progression.
Sure. Well, I think we're going to leave it there. I don't know about you, but this hour kind of flew by for me.
Yeah, thank you. You guys have asked such great questions. And I'm happy to talk to anybody, after this video. If they want to talk to me, my email is Hare, like the rabbit, Hare, @poynter.org. I'm happy to talk. Follow me on Twitter. I'll follow you back. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.